The dev culture is not for snowflakes. You gotta be able to take the heat if you want to be in the kitchen in Solana. It's a great culture for building high performance systems. 1 million TPS is, to put it in context, it's enough transactions to run the entire Visa network, plus the entire MasterCard network, plus the entire Amex network, plus the entire Discover network, and the New York Stock Exchange, and the NASDAQ, and the CME. 10x multiple is $600 billion market cap for Solana.
GM, and welcome back to Solana Floor. We're chatting with Max Resnick today, and he's been all over the timeline recently with his candid opinions on SIMD 228. But when he's not arguing with Solana OGs, Max is actually the lead economist at Anza, which develops Solana's core infrastructure like the Agave validator. So I'm excited to chat with Max about, first of all, why he moved to Solana from the Ethereum ecosystem and where he thinks Solana's headed from both a technical perspective and a leadership perspective too. Max, GM, and thank you for making time to talk to us today. I really appreciate it. And I am excited to pick your brain on some technical stuff. But I have some high-level questions for you as well about, where Solana's headed generally, where the crypto market's moving, broadly speaking. So before we get into those technical questions, I want to ask you about you as well, in case the audience isn't aware. You were very deeply involved in the Ethereum ecosystem for a long time. So maybe let's start with that decision. When did you decide, and why did you decide to move over to Solana?
Yeah, I guess I was kind of interested in Solana development activity that was going on around, I would say, February of last year. I was interested in some of the work that Andrew Fitzgerald at Anza, who's been doing some of the work on the scheduler, was doing. Interested in how the MEV situation was very different on Solana. There were some very heated discussions around SIMD 96. There were some discussions around Quick. So that kind of piqued my interest initially. And then over the course of the year, I just started reading more and more, ended up going to Breakpoint in Singapore. And I went to one of the Solana Core Dev meetings there. And I was like, hey, this is like a really nice, very intense, but very productive culture. So at that point, my kind of perspective on what was going on in Solana and the level of potential energy was updated. Then I was like, where's the right spot within Solana if I was going to explore that option? So I actually talked to a bunch of places. I was previously working very closely at MetaMask at Consensus. So I talked to Phantom, talked to some trading shops, talked to everybody, and then I had some offers and I asked Toly, like, hey, which is the best one to take? And he was like, oh, why don't you interview at Anza? Because we'd love to have you working as close as possible to the core protocol. And so that's when I interviewed at Anza. And we were like, this is a really good fit. Anza didn't have anybody who was specifically working on econ-related stuff. And there were a lot of econ-related things that were important. Fee markets, vote credits, inflation, which we just had a big vote about. So it was kind of a natural fit and a cultural fit, and that's how I decided to jump over.
That makes a lot of sense. Curious that Toly was involved in that decision as well. And you mentioned some economics-related topics that you're working on. It might be a bit confusing for most people because Anza is obviously a software-focused organization, and your title is now lead economist, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, how do you square that circle?
Yeah, I guess I would say that my particular subject area within economics is this field called mechanism design, and it kind of came out of the study of games and game theory. And mechanism design is just, how do I make a game where people honestly participate in the protocol and vote on time? So I would say it's not too far out of the realm of what's going on at Anza.
That makes sense. And you're working on some pretty critical infrastructure related, tasks over at Anza with the team as well. Can you break down sort of, a high level, what is the team most focused on right now, and maybe why it's super critical for Solana's long-term success as well?
Right. So I guess maybe some people don't even know what Anza is, but Anza is the top dev shop for everything Solana these days. It's basically came out of almost 100% of our engineers are former Solana Labs employees who maintained the Solana Labs client and then came over to Anza, a new organization, and maintenance of the core Solana Labs client shifted over to what we're now building, which is Agave, which is now what's running the majority of the Solana network until Firedancer launches at the end of this year. So we maintain the core client that runs Solana right now. And 95% of the network is running either Agave or Jito Agave or Pal Agave, which are slight modifications that do other MEV stuff. But at the core, like all the mechanics are maintained by Anza engineers. So that's like 95% of what we do is work on how to make Solana as good as possible, how to make Solana as fast as possible. And we work also very closely with the Firedancer team on optimizations to the protocol as well. But right now, I think a lot of improvements that you're seeing on the network, like, for example, the fact that average slot time is now down 20% in the last 3 months since we deployed Agave 2.1. These are partly a result of some of the performance improvements that have happened from people like Alessandro, people like Brennan, who are just like everyday IBRLing, optimizing the code base in Agave. So that's kind of what we work on at Anza. And I'm less involved in some of those particular things, but I'm involved in other areas, vote credits, microstructure, all kinds of stuff that is also really important, but isn't as directly like make number go up, make chain faster.
Yes, and speaking of those metrics that we talk about so often, when we think about Firedancer, we often hear 1 million TPS as the sort of benchmark of where we want to be. And Dan Albert recently said that nobody's bullish enough on Firedancer, which I think is fair. But to you personally, what does that mean from a technical capacity perspective, reaching that 1 million TPS? What does it really mean? And what does it change for adoption as well?
Right. I think the first thing to note is that Firedancer isn't the only team that is working towards that. And the Firedancer team is extremely smart and dedicated. A bunch of ex-HFT, or I guess they're still currently employed by Jump, so they're currently HFT engineers. And they're building something to scale to 1 million TPS. And that's what we're also trying to do at Anza. We also have a bunch of former HFT and former FANG engineers who are working really hard to optimize the Agave client. And the hope is that if both clients can achieve 1 million TPS, then the chain can achieve 1 million TPS. So both clients are working really hard at that. The way that we have to do it is basically every component of the network has to be able to handle 1 million TPS capacity. And so right now, the way we're doing it is we're kind of surveying the performance of the Agave client, and we look at where the bottleneck is. So which part of the process cannot handle 1 million TPS right now. And then we try to improve that particular part of the process. Once that's fixed, there's a new bottleneck. We've raised the TPS somewhat. Now we go fix the next bottleneck. And the way that Firedancer are doing it is slightly different, which is because they have the luxury of not having to support the network right now, they're doing this kind of rebuilding of every component, reimagining every component from scratch. And so they do things like look at every single piece and test it and make sure that the thing they're putting in can handle 1 million TPS. And the hope is that when they get to the point where everything's battle tested and performant, then because everything has already been tested for 1 million TPS, there will be no bottlenecks that stop 1 million TPS. So that's the kind of two competing strategies right now. And we'll see which one is ultimately able to be faster. But the good thing is, if there is something in Firedancer that's a major performance improvement that is bottlenecking us on Agave, we can always take a lot of inspiration from the implementation details that they have done. So, and that's happened a few times already where they've figured out a really fast way to do signature verification. And then we've kind of taken inspiration from that implementation and used it in Agave as well. And the goal is not like which client wins? It's like, how do we make the network win?
I like that approach to winning together. That makes a lot of sense to me. And you sort of reminded me of a conversation that you had with the Bankless guys back in September. So this would, or at least it aired in September, so it would have been recorded around Breakpoint. And you were having this conversation about the difference between sort of Ethereum and Solana, how things are done. And you mentioned that part of the reason why you were sort of had these issues was because you wanted to build things the right way. So looking back on that conversation, do you feel, first of all, was that a turning point for you when you had that conversation with the bankless guys? Did you think, okay, actually, maybe I could go and work with Solana? And looking back between then and now, do you feel that you now get to work on the more important things?
I guess I would say, like, at the time of that conversation, I was pretty committed to trying to help Ethereum win. I guess that wasn't really that was before Breakpoint. So when I finally went to Breakpoint and I saw the difference between, like, I think I had one day where I was on Ethereum all core dev call, and then I went directly from that to the in-person core dev meeting for Solana. And so that was just kind of like a big juxtaposition, like, where do I want to spend my time and effort in which of these environments does it make sense? And am I going to be happy and more importantly, be able to have maximum impact? And that was like the real turning point for me, I guess, where I was like, hey, this is just so much easier to get things done in Solana land than in ETH land because of the structure of the way that we do development. So this was the bankless episode you're referencing was before that. So at that point, I was kind of pretty committed to trying to make ETH as good as possible. But I don't think, like, ETH is at a point where it's very hard to change things, and it doesn't matter how good the idea is or anything. It's just hard to change things because that's the way the system is, and it's nobody's fault. And that's how blockchains naturally ossify over time. And Solana is younger and doesn't have that issue yet.
Fair enough. You said getting things done in Solana land versus getting things done elsewhere. Let's talk about the SIMD 228 proposal then. It was this, for the audience, proposal about reducing Solana's inflation, amongst other things. Now, there was a lot of noise from both sides of the argument leading up to the decision, leading up to the vote, I should say, about whether it should or shouldn't pass. And you were a very vocal part of that process. So looking back on it, first of all, are you happy with the way things turned out? Do you think it was a catastrophe that it didn't pass? What are your high-level thoughts? And yeah, if you have some major agreements or disagreements with the way it turned out, for example, do you think we can rectify that as an ecosystem? Or do we just take the L and move on?
I guess I would say I can give why I got involved in the proposal, because actually coming from ETH, there was a very contentious inflation proposal there. And my first reaction to this inflation stuff was, I'm not going to touch that because it's super controversial, which was probably the right. Yeah. Anyway, then I looked at the proposal and people were asking me to comment. And of course, like, I should be commenting because it's my job. So,
and you did catch some flack, I think, for your opinions as well, right?
Yeah. So this was basically a month before the vote happened. I was commenting on the proposal. In the original form of the proposal, I was worried if it passed, it had this feature where it could set inflation to zero. And if it set inflation to zero, we wouldn't have any room to work with to incentivize good behavior like voting and voting in a timely manner, including votes, et cetera. So I actually proposed a modification to the authors of the proposal, which ended up being the final version of 228. And in doing that, I was like, it looked likely that was going to pass at that time, the old version. And then I made a slight modification, which was spiritually similar, but didn't have the property that inflation would ever go to zero. And that's how I got involved in the process. And it looked at that point like it wasn't that controversial. And then it got super controversial in the last week. So I guess I was right that it was going to be very controversial, but I don't regret being a part of it, even though it was, big and I caught some flack for it, because I think it's really important to address inflation. That proposal didn't pass. We're not going to make a new proposal right away because that would be exhausting for everyone. We're going to hopefully talk to everybody, get everybody on board with something that is probably slightly more mild and that everybody can get on board with, and pass something that, hopefully with 80% of the vote, instead of, I think it would have been a little bit contentious even if it had passed at a 70% margin. Yeah. The nice thing is, like, it was a great show of force for the Solana network. It was 74% of the stake voted, which was huge. The last contentious vote was only 51%. So it was a fun process to be a part of too, as like the person who was calling everybody up. And I got to meet a lot of people who were validating and participating on both sides who I hadn't met before. So I don't regret being a part of it. I wish it had passed, obviously, but it didn't. So we'll do something else and get everybody on board.
I'm totally with you on the voter turnout argument. Good to see sort of public discussion, high turnout. People are really engaged. People care about making the network stronger, faster, more secure, all that. One of the arguments against it was that it sort of fits into this category of YOLO economics. Curious if you feel strongly about that. And can you tell me a little bit more about sort of what YOLO economic means in terms of reducing inflation super aggressively, and how that would have impacted or might still impact people in the trenches who are maybe a little bit more focused on the speculative side of life in Solana than yourself?
Yeah, I don't agree with that critique at all. I think that critique was pretty dishonest and, like, frankly, a little bit disrespectful to the people who spent a lot of time working on the proposal. There is a serious misunderstanding from some people who levied that critique that there is any possibility of doing these kinds of changes with, like, there's just no way to gather data on a change like this because of the way that macroeconomics works. Like, macro is more of an art than a science, I would say. And we have a bunch of heuristics that we use. And the way that, say, the Fed chair in the US adjusts inflation rates is not too different from the way that we're doing this, which is you use your heuristics, you apply them, and then you adjust the rates. I think the ideal system probably is you have somebody who gets to look at all the variables and gets to adjust every 3 months the rates, just like, how the Fed funds rate works. But that's not the way that a blockchain is going to work. We're not going to have a contentious inflation vote when I want to change the inflation by 25 bips every 3 months. That's just ridiculous. So the goal of the proposal was to have something that would auto adjust inflation based on the core metrics that matter, which are staking rate. And I don't agree with the YOLO economics argument. It wasn't that. We spent a lot of time thinking about it. The authors incorporate a lot of feedback about that from me, from Brian Long. And so I think it was just basically fake news that it was YOLO economics. There were other arguments that were not in bad faith, but that one I think was not correct.
What would be a solid way to argue against the proposal then, without bad faith or introducing sort of reductionist terms like YOLO economics? What's the right way to do it to get enough of the validator community behind you, against that proposal?
I guess if you want me to steelman that kind of there were two, I think, very reasonable arguments against the proposal. One of them was made by Lily, which was institutions like nominal yield. So they like this kind of high nominal yield. I have my doubts about whether that's actually true, but at least that is a reasonable argument if it's the case that the premise that institutions like high nominal yield is true, which many people believe, then the idea of lowering the nominal yield is probably not good for institutional adoption. So that's the one idea that Lily had, and her main argument and reason for advocating against the proposal was basically, we're in this critical period of institutional adoption. We don't want to rock the boat. We think that institutions probably care about this kind of imaginary yield number that shows up on their screen. And so we should probably not touch it right now, at least, but maybe in the future. And then the other argument was made by some of the smaller validators. They were just worried that these changes would have reduced their rewards to the point where they would have to shut down their validator. And so those were the two main critiques that I would say that were not at all in bad faith. I just disagreed with them, but they were very reasonable arguments.
Are there any more proposals that you're looking forward to, participating in, or do you think, no, they're all too radical, I'm not going to get involved? I've already caught way too much flack talking about this on Twitter.
No, I'm not done for sure. So I just proposed something else, SIMD 257, which would remove vote fees which vote fees are one of the most expensive parts of running a Solana validator. It actually costs around 2 SOL a day. So like over $200 a day just to vote if you run a Solana validator. And that's kind of extremely expensive if you're a very small validator. So the goal is to get rid of those. But it turns out that those are kind of critical for preventing denial of service attacks on the network. So if you want to get rid of them, you have to do a bunch of other changing stuff around. And so that's what 257 tries to do, is remove the vote fees, but then keep it safe to remove the vote fees.
Is it going to pass?
We're still in the draft stage, so we haven't decided to bring it to a vote yet. But I think probably it's quite a big change, so we'll split it up into a few things, and I think people will be broadly in support of it or some version of it, because it doesn't really change validator economics that much, but it does make it so that smaller validators have an easier time staying afloat.
Looking forward to hearing about that development. And you mentioned institutional adoption there, and I want to go back to that because we always hear about the next billion users and onboarding billions of users and how that's sort of the North Star metric for some people. But then it seems lately, and you mentioned Lily as an example, institutional adoption and that narrative is been getting stronger and stronger, all sorts of really bullish news. Do you think Solana's near future growth is going to be driven more by institutions or retail?
It's a good question. I think at some point there's not that many more retail, and there's this kind of phenomenon in stocks where people are constantly putting money into their retirement accounts, and that's just constant inflows into the stock market. And that's why like the S&P just grinds up every month, because people are constantly putting money into it. Has to go somewhere. And so I think it would be extremely good for the ecosystem and for Solana if people started putting Solana and other crypto assets in their retirement accounts, because it's just like a constant inflow of people who want into and want to buy in. And that's like very good. I think it's a little bit of like a what got us here with the retail won't get us there with institutions. And so I'm not sure the same fast and cheap playbook is going to bridge us over to the institutions. I'm working on some other major architectural changes that would help us with market structure, that would help us with all kinds of those things. But these, I hope that the next stage of growth is institutional, because it means that we've done something extremely correct in that people start to trust that this chain is a real chain that is doing real economic activity, that is trusted enough for people to put their retirement money in, and for companies and asset managers to put other people's money in. That would be a great development for the chain.
I mean, there is a lot happening on this institutional front. You got people like Marinade that are working on institutional staking products. Sol Strategies, a Canadian publicly traded company, they're buying, thousands of Sol left, right, and center and staking it, which is great as well. You mentioned there that institutional staking hopefully accelerates a little bit more, and that's fair. But what are we missing then? It's not surely an ETF. It's obviously not Trump in office. It's obviously not the SEC changing leadership. So what is that sort of key unlock that Solana needs before institutions come flooding in?
Yeah, I think it's starting to trickle in a little bit. Part of it's just outreach, and these people, many of these institutions, like you ask them which cryptos they know, they probably know like Bitcoin and ETH. And so breaking into that set is really important, right? Just even having the name recognition of, oh, Bitcoin, ETH, Solana's like fast and cheap, the new kid on the block. That's part of it. Part of it is making the chain more useful for financial applications and bringing more volume and more fees and metrics and fundamentals to the chain itself. That's the part that I'm trying to work on. And another part of it is just being around and being up. We've had 2 years without any outages now, which is great. I hope that continues. And so we kind of need to outlive that, the outage chain narrative that was from 2 years ago. We haven't had an outage in 2 years. Like, that's really good and hard to do. And so that, as that continues, and as the track record continues, and as the fees and metrics and users all continue to happen on Solana, institutions will naturally just become more comfortable with participating.
Fingers crossed we get there sooner rather than later. And also on this topic, another thing that gets sort of thrown around lately is this idea that meme coins, and specifically the high profile meme coin launches that, became or looked like rug pulls. You got heads of state, Trump was involved, Melania, Central African Republic, Libra in Argentina caused a bit of a meltdown. So from this institutional adoption perspective, do you think it's caused any significant reputational damage to Solana, such that, this, what you're mentioning there with Solana being amongst Bitcoin and Ethereum as this sort of recognizable crypto names, did we shoot ourselves in the foot reputationally?
I don't think so. I think people can separate the things people are doing on the chain from the chain itself. It's not like DeFi summer on ETH was like a complete scam. Like, there were so many scams, right? You were locking, you were yield farming. There was a new launch every week that went to zero in 3 months after the team had sold their entire allocation. The difference with meme coins is just faster. And so it's just like the rug happens in one day rather than in 1 year or in 2 years. And that is acute, but it also is, I don't think anybody was like, ETH is a scam chain because of all these scam DeFi things that were just like Ponzi's on ETH. Like, no, that wasn't ETH's fault. Like, they made a permissionless, that's what permissionless means. It's a permissionless ledger that anybody can use. And if they want to launch scam coins, they can launch scam coins. We're not going to celebrate them rugging users. It's not great. It would be great if that was used somewhere else and wasn't going to people who are rugging, but people are going to build what they want to build. And if people keep giving the scammers money, then scammers are going to keep scamming.
And I want to ask you on that about scaling. It's another conversation that doesn't necessarily get thrown around in Solana as much as it does in Ethereum. And they have this layer 2 idea. People in Solana think it's parasitic. So where do you stand on that? Not so much the monolithic versus layer 2 scaling discussion, but is Ethereum shooting itself in the foot, let's say, by not coming up with a better economic structure between the core layer and the layer 2s?
Yeah, I actually proposed at some point an idea, alignment taxes, which would have allowed ETH to tax rollups based on the economic activity that was going on there. So if there was like $10 billion of stable coins on a rollup like Base, for example, I propose an idea of how ETH could charge taxes on that equivalent to the way that they tax people who hold ETH. So if you hold ETH, they inflate ETH at 2% a year, and they take basically 2% of your ETH away. And that's because the chain is providing economic security for your ETH, right? And if you want to, like, if you make an L2 that relies on the security of ETH, but don't pay anything because you don't hold a bunch of ETH, it's kind of parasitic in that you're a free rider there. And the main thesis for rollups is that they're building on ETH because they want the ETH security, but they're not paying anything for ETH security. So I think they should really, really consider this, and they should have considered it a lot earlier because it's going to be really hard to do something now. But there's, it's a major issue for them that they've given away a lot of the revenue and a lot of the users and a lot of the power to these rollups.
Where does Solana fit into this discussion of parasitic layer 2s? And there's been a bunch of proposals. Some companies are very active, saying that they're going to have niche use cases for rollups, and that they'll sort of function in a relatively similar way to ETH layer 2s, but then they'll aim to be less parasitic, in their words, not mine. So yeah, what are your high level thoughts on Solana layer 2s rollups? Do we need them?
I think we definitely have the next 100x of scaling unlock. So we don't, if we scale 100x from here and we get to 1 million TPS, right now we're at about 1,000 TPS. So we got to scale quite a bit to get there. But if we do that, then, we scale 100x, 1,000x from here, and we get to 100,000, 1 million TPS, and we still have scaling issues, then we might need to go to rollups. But at least our next 10 years of scaling is laid out for us, and that we have a lot more capacity and a lot more room to scale the L1. So I'm not too worried about whether we need to do any kind of rollups or anything right now. I think probably 1,000,000 TPS is, to put it in context, it's enough transactions to run the entire Visa network, plus the entire MasterCard network, plus the entire Amex network, plus the entire Discover network, and the New York Stock Exchange, and the NASDAQ, and the CME. So put it all together, that's 1 million, about 1 million TPS. So I think we can get to 1 million TPS. We have enough capacity for a lot of stuff. And if there's still more demand than that, we're in a really good spot, because now we've filled up 1 million TPS. A million TPS at 0.2 cents per transaction is $60 billion a year of ARR. And so that sounds pretty, 60 bill a year ARR, 10x multiple is $600 billion market cap for Solana. So that's, for me, that's like the best case scenario, is we scale and there's still more demand for capacity than we have. And then we charge, a fraction of a cent per transaction, and we have real revenue and real fundamentals behind a valuation that's much higher than it is today.
Sign me up. It sounds like the place to be. Quick question on leadership, because I think you're in a fairly unique position here to talk about the different sort of foundation approaches. The Ethereum Foundation's obviously caught a lot of criticism lately, and it seems that they're taking some of that criticism on board and making some incremental changes. Over on the Solana side, we have this proposal or idea that the Solana Foundation is slowly going to sort of dissolve itself and work itself out of a job. Where do you feel Solana's headed if we sort of lose this semi-centralized leadership decision-making structure that we have in the foundation? Are we doomed to make the same mistakes that Ethereum has been making, or is it the right decision for Solana to sort of dissolve the foundation?
I definitely don't think it's the right decision to dissolve the foundation at this point. I think the amount of, we're not done. The job's not done. Like, Solana, we may have beaten Ethereum, okay, but Solana was not conceived to kill Ethereum. It was conceived to kill NASDAQ. It was conceived to be decentralized NASDAQ, and we're not there yet. And we're about 1/100th of the way there. And so I think the work that the foundation is doing is like incredibly important for getting us there. And they do things like fund the client teams. They host Breakpoint. They have tons of other grants that they do. They're pretty disciplined now, actually, with the grants and the way that they manage the milestones. So I think that would be definitely a mistake. I think Lily is, incredibly strong. We have our disagreements on 228, but she's incredibly competent and very strong leader. Dan, who's the executive director of the foundation, also incredibly strong leader. And so we don't have any issues with the strength of leadership. And to that end, I would also say, I know Tomas, who's the new executive director at the EF, and I think he's a pretty solid leader as well. And so I hope that they, with that change that they've made, have some positive impacts.
What's next for Solana then? What can we really look forward to that isn't just price action, that isn't just 1 million transactions?
Right. So I think, first of all, like 1 million TPS is a really big lift, and it's continuing every day. We just put out a SIMD for moving to 60 million CUs. Right now we're at 50 million CUs. We were at 48 million CUs before this current Agave version. So that first step of the 2 million CU was just to test that there were no hard constants coded anywhere for the CUs that would break something. So we did that. There's no hard constants. There's no hard cap somewhere in the code that we have to go refactor. The next step is up to 60 million. We're going to get to 100 million CUs this year on Agave, which is double the current capacity. So that's really important. And a lot of people are doing a lot of work on that. My work is looking at how can we change the architecture of the chain to make the 1 million TPS easier, to make the market structure better for a decentralized NASDAQ. So I'm working really hard on this idea called multi-leader, which would allow more than one leader to include transactions per slot. And that's mostly for market microstructure reasons, to produce tighter spreads and better prices on-chain for on-chain exchanges. But there's other people who are working on consensus upgrades that would make consensus work better. They're working on improving Turbine, and more at an architectural level than at a code quality and code optimization level, although it's kind of hard to distinguish the two. They sometimes blend together. But there's tons of work going on in terms of how do we make the chain as good as possible. And then there's other people who are working on UX. At Anza, we have some people who've been working on passkeys, native passkeys in Solana, and putting the cryptography to handle passkeys, which is super important for UX. And so all these kinds of things are happening. There's dev tooling work as well going on at Anza.
Where do we follow along with the developments at Anza? And also maybe where do we follow you for the sort of heated, spicy discussions and hot takes on future proposals?
Yeah, I'm trying to be a little bit more relaxed now that I'm
No, give the people what they want, Max. Come on. Be opinionated.
Yeah, my Twitter handle is at Max Resnick 1. And yeah, I definitely will put a zinger in there every once in a while. And Anza.xyz is our website where you can see our blog, where you can see all of the work that's going on in terms of increasing CU limit and dev tooling and passkeys and UX and stuff like this. And you can also follow the Anza account on Twitter.
Exciting. And we can see you in Istanbul for Crossroads Conference, which is happening in April as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be there. I'll be definitely spicy on stage. Always bring the spice on stage.
That's what we want to hear. Max, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And catch up soon in Istanbul.
Thanks for having me.